ICE agents and law enforcement, they use different tactics to encourage people to talk, even though they have the right to remain silent.
ICE officers can come up to you, say in the street, in like the public area of a restaurant without a warrant. And again, what we reiterate is that you have the right to not talk about your immigrant status or your citizenship status. And the best practices that you can implement is to remain silent and to say verbally, I remain silent. I'm not going to speak until I have access to my lawyer.
Hi, and welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. I'm Dee.
And I'm Amir.
And we are discussing topics affecting Black, Brown, and other communities of color nationwide and worldwide.
For this episode, we focus on what this new presidential term means for immigrant rights. And we're joined by Chloe Edmonds at White & Case, who helped the Know Your Rights Camp app develop content around immigrants' rights. Thanks for joining us, Chloe.
Hi, thanks for having me. And, thanks to the entire team for helping to put this information together for the app.
Absolutely. You want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do at White & Case?
Yes, I am an associate at White & Case in the commercial litigation group. Before coming to White & Case, I also got a master's degree that is in conflict resolution, focusing on humanitarian emergency and refugee work. And outside of my commercial litigation practice, I also do quite a bit of pro bono work that is focused on asylum clients and also focused on civil rights cases like 1983 claims.
Great. And tell us more about the collaboration between White & Case and the Know Your Rights Camp.
Sure. So White & Case has been working with Know Your Rights Camp to provide legal information about the different rights that are available, whether it is immigration rights, protestor rights, and also rights when a police officer stops you. And so the app breaks down what information is available and what rights are available based on the state. And it is something that you can pull up on your phone and look at to know what your rights are when ICE comes to your house or comes to work. What are your rights if a police officer stops you or if you are protesting in Washington, D.C.? So it's a pretty useful tool that White & Case has been working on to provide information for the app.
Since we're talking about immigration rights, and that seems to be what's making the news a lot lately with all the mass deportations, what advice would you give to folks? What's in the app that people should be paying attention to, especially if they are a migrant family?
Yes, this is an incredibly timely topic right now. As you said, there's been mass deportations that have been started with the new Trump administration. There's been over 1,000 deportations in Chicago alone on Sunday. And there's a lot of rights that most migrants don't always know of and are getting, deported without warrants, which they have a right to only be deported when they have a warrant if they're in their home. So there are certain rights on the app that are associated with whether ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer, comes to your home or work. And so, for instance, if there is a migrant family who is approached by ICE at their home, these migrants have the opportunity to say no to them entering their home or to ask for a warrant, which is something that is signed by a judge and is supposed to have information available, such as their name, accurate information, a certain amount of time, and is supposed to be signed by a judge in order to be valid. A migrant can ask for that information. And so what we recommend on the app is to keep your door closed, ask to have that warrant pushed up against a window or slid under the door so you can see if it is a valid warrant. And while migrants don't actually have the right to necessarily see that warrant, you can verbally say, I don't allow you access to my home because I do not see a valid warrant. And then you have the right to tell them that you do not approve of entry into their home. And you have the right to remain silent. And what is important, I think, that most migrant families need to know is that you need to verbalize this right to remain silent. You need to say, I am deciding to use my right to remain silent, and I am not going to speak until I talk to my lawyer. And what's really important is that you're not required to tell any information about your migrant status, about your citizenship status. You have the right to remain silent and to tell an officer that's approaching your home that they don't have access to your home if they don't have a valid judicial warrant.
Exactly. And it's really important to exercise that right, because we know ICE agents and law enforcement, they use different tactics to encourage people to talk, even though they have the right to remain silent. I mean, we know it's called the Miranda right for a reason. It came from the Miranda case, which, was a brown person experiencing these abuses. But thanks again for your work on the app, which, just to say, that the app is available on both Android and iOS devices. And the information that Chloe spoke about is available in both English and in Spanish.
Yes, and there's also, I want to make clear that these warrants are required when they come to your home and when they come to, your place of work, wherever there is a private area. But people can still approach you on the street without a warrant. ICE officers can come up to you, say, in the street, in like the public area of a restaurant without a warrant. And again, what we reiterate is that you have the right to not talk about your immigrant status or your citizenship status. And the best practices that you can implement is to remain silent and to say verbally, I remain silent. I'm not going to speak until I have access to my lawyer. And I do not see a valid judicial warrant, and I won't give you access to my home if you're in your home or if you're in a private area at work.
So we've been talking a lot about knowing your rights and knowing your reality. Something we also heard is that you shouldn't sign anything until your attorney comes, because we've seen ICE agents sort of get folks who can't read or speak English well to agree to be deported. And so that's not something that's necessarily a legal right, but it's a best practice. Are there any other best practices that you would advise for folks that might be subject to interacting with ICE?
Yes. So, one thing that I think is important, given what we've been seeing happen currently in Chicago, in Miami, in New York, is that migrants are seeing that it's not just people with ICE across their vests, it's also other federal agents that are working alongside with ICE. And people aren't always aware of who is approaching them at their house or on the street. And so anytime someone does approach you, if you are a migrant and you are being cautious right now, given what is going on in the US, be careful about who you're speaking to, about your status. If somebody does approach you and is asking for information, say that you will not talk about it. You have the right not to talk about your status. If it is somebody that you can identify as working with ICE, tell them that you have the right to remain silent and you're going to remain silent until you have access to an attorney. What's important is that they are not required to provide you an attorney. So I would not wait to have them assign an attorney to you, but you do have a right to remain silent until you can go and get an attorney to speak with. And so, like you said, anytime that you sign something, you always want to make sure that you know what you're signing, and you want to have legal advice on whether it is a good idea to sign something. Never sign something that you don't know. And another really big thing is never lie. So, in addition to the right to remain silent, if you are feeling the need to say something, never say anything that is untrue. Don't provide any kind of documentation that is false documentation. It is always better to remain silent, and you never want to lie about your status. And another thing is, if you do have anything like a green card or immigrant papers, you should always have them on you, because you are required once you're 18 to have those immigrant documents on you and to present them if asked. So always keep those on you. If you have access to a lawyer or you know a lawyer that you could reach out to, make sure that you know their number, that your family knows their number, and keep those documents on you so that if somebody stops you and you have a valid immigrant ID or license, you can provide that information.
And another really cool and important thing that the app does is distinguish between different states and different circuits, right? Because the law here in California could be different than the law in New York or in the South. And We know we've seen different localities, city governments, and sometimes even school districts are now becoming what they call sanctuary cities or sanctuary districts that try to create more protections for their citizens to guard them from ICE raids and other things. Have you seen different things come across variations across different states that people should be aware of?
That's a really great question. I think a lot of times you're going to see variations less with immigrant rights and issues around immigration across states because those are normally federal laws than you're going to see necessarily when it comes to a police officer's rights when you're being stopped or protesters' rights. Those differ a little bit more. But when it comes to immigration, yes, there's going to be differences when it comes to safe haven, when it comes to if a certain state is allowing their police forces to work with ICE. Those are things that could differ. As far as we know right now, Chicago and New York are not having their police officers working alongside ICE to facilitate deportations. But that's something that, we always have to stay apprised of and could change and is different state to state.
Right. And let's talk about the right to asylum for a bit as well, because you've done some asylum work in the past. Now, my understanding of it is it's a human right that exists, beyond borders, the right to seek asylum in different places. But what we're seeing with this current administration is attacks on that, whether it's through the Remain in Mexico policy, whether it's deleting one of the apps that allowed for people to apply for asylum. Can you share more about what you've seen in your experience and just what some of the actions of this administration might mean for citizens?
Yes, so asylum, whenever you come seeking for asylum in the US, you're asking for protection that's under a very specific ground, saying that you are unable to stay in your home country and that you are seeking what's called asylum, which is protections in another country and here, the United States, because particularly you can't go back to your home without risk of being persecuted or harmed. And there's a very specific law that you have to abide by or that you have to fall into specific categories for to gain asylum. But there is an entire process to be able to vet people on if they can be granted asylum in the United States. And one of the things is that as soon as you enter, you have the right to say that you would like asylum, even if you are at the border, you say that you would like to seek asylum in the United States, and then you're put into a process that determines whether you have the right to asylum or not. And I work with a lot of asylum seekers who have not been granted asylum yet, but are in the asylum seeking process and are not able to be deported because they are in that process. They're law abiding citizens. The people that I've worked with are fantastic people, and they're a part of a process that vets whether they are safe to seek asylum here, whether they are law abiding citizens, and whether they fall under these legal grounds. And with the new administration, one of the things that has been discussed is an entire halt of entry of all undocumented migrants in the US, which includes denying people who are asking for asylum upon entry the right to an asylum hearing. Um, Generally, whenever it comes to executive orders, we don't know what executive order is going to be upheld. You've already seen executive orders be, temporarily put on hold or blocked by courts. And so while that is something that the administration has put out, we don't know what is going to happen there, but there's always going to be a change in the administration and in asylum seeking. And that's something that we always have to keep an eye out for our clients to try to make sure that we can get them the best advocacy for asylum that we can.
Mir made reference to the Remain in Mexico policy, and I think people don't quite understand what that means. It's actually called the Migrant Protection Protocols. It basically, speaking to what you said, forced migrants who came to seek asylum, who entered over the southern border, to actually go back to Mexico and stay there until they can get a hearing, until they can get their cases heard. And that was a policy during the first Trump administration that everyone is afraid is going to get reinstated during the second administration, because I think the numbers say that during the first administration, there were about 65,000 migrants not from Mexico who were struggling to find temporary shelter in northern Mexico. And so there's all these little things that people aren't realizing have to do with the asylum, protections. And it's all these things that we're needing to pay attention to. And I think it's people take these threats sort of for granted just because it's an executive order. But we've seen that he's done it before and will do it again. And now it seems like the next front in his in the administration's attempt to halt immigration of any kind is threatening the birthright citizenship. What are your thoughts on how that executive order is going to play out?
So, like I said, executive orders, they are not, immediately binding. They go through a legal process where they can be challenged. And with the naturalization executive order, we've already seen that happen. There's a judge in Seattle that has already on Thursday put a temporary block on that implementation of that executive order. And he called it blatantly unconstitutional. And there is going to be a process to see whether this is an executive order that will be upheld. But there's also other cases that have come forward because of it. The ACLU has already filed a complaint against it. Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project, because this impacts asylum seekers as well. It impacts migrants across, all categories. But there are already 4 major cases that have been filed against the Trump's naturalization executive order. So what we have to do is, wait and let the process run its course to see which executive orders will actually stand and which are going to be blocked by the courts.
Right. And I was surprised to see that judge say that it was one of the most unconstitutional things he had seen in 40 years. And this judge in Washington that you referred to was actually appointed by the Reagan administration. So, not a partisan issue or anything like that, but just looking at the Constitution, the attempt to attack what's been ingrained in our Constitution for over a century now.
Yes, well, even with the strong language that the court used, I caution anybody from discounting any executive order or any law because we have to wait to see what's going to happen. And anytime that you're dealing with immigration issues, it's always better to lean on the side of being overly cautious than assume that it's not going to go through or assume that a court is going to rule a certain way. We don't know until we see the court's outcome. So, at least for migrant families that are looking for ways to protect themselves, I think it's reasonable to still act in a way that you take this as something that is potentially viable. And not wait until we see the court system play out to take this seriously and to get, your finances in order, your family in order to make sure that you're protecting your family as much as you can.
Actually, I'm really glad to hear you say that we should be taking these executive orders seriously. I think we see that the administration has referred to expanding ideological screenings and reinstating travel bans from certain countries. Travel bans that have been removed, and they might disproportionately affect immigrants from African and Asian nations. Do you see any of these being sort of something we need to look out for next, or anything that we should be worried about?
So when it comes down to it, I think we've seen what the first round of this administration does, and now we have an idea of what the trajectory is of this administration. But we have to kind of keep our eyes apprised and stay vigilant for what is going to be changing. What we already know is that the borders are has already said in this administration that there is going to be an increase in immigration and deportations. So I think that's something we can reasonably expect. Whether it comes down to specific policies that Trump implemented in his first administration, I think we're going to have to wait to see. But one of the things, at least as a lawyer, is that I don't think it matters whether we believe that something is maybe going to happen, maybe not. I think when it comes to migrant issues, if you are a family that may be impacted by it, you should, err on the side of caution, make sure that you have everything in order, make sure that you know your rights so that if something does occur, you know what your rights are and how to protect yourself and your family.
So it seems like the best advice we could give, and it seems that the core of this conversation in terms of protecting yourself, protecting those around you, is to know your rights. And the app is becoming an invaluable tool because of the work that Chloe and White and Case has done. And so if there's any last thought, any advice you'd like to give folks, Chloe, what would you want to, what do you think people should really be aware of and hold dear?
I mean, I think that's a great point. Just knowledge is power. The more knowledge that you have of what your rights are, the safer you're going to be in this country. Whether, anything goes against your rights, at least you know what they are and therefore can hold steady to them. You know, these officers aren't required to tell you that you have the right to tell them that you do not let them in without a warrant. But if you know that you don't have to let them in, you can keep the door shut. If you know that you have the right to seek out an attorney before you speak to anybody, then you can advocate for yourself to not say anything until you do have access to your lawyer. And if you know that they are not required to give you a lawyer, then you're not going to be waiting, hoping for these agencies to issue a lawyer yourself. It means that you have better opportunities to prepare your family so that everybody knows where your immigration documents are, knows the number of important emergency contacts if you were ever able to be if you were ever deported. And information is power. So for instance, when I was in law school, I didn't know that the right to remain silent was something that you actively had to tell somebody that you were invoking. Just being silent does not invoke that right. And that means that they can continue to push for information and for you to speak. So just the ability to know the simple lines of telling somebody that you don't allow them into your home unless they have a valid warrant, even if they push their way into your home, you can reiterate, I am not approving of you entering my home without a valid warrant. I'm not going to speak until I get an opportunity to speak to a lawyer, and I am invoking my right to remain silent. Even if it doesn't seem like it in the moment, that does a lot to protect you in the long run and to protect your potential ability to stay in the country and to wait until you have access to an attorney who can help you navigate your immigration status and the situation that you're in.
Critical issues, I think, especially with ICE, who we know oftentimes are in plain clothes and try to be a little more informal than the regular law enforcement and make people give away their rights. Will put their foot in the door and start to walk in houses before even asking for permission. So thank you for that knowledge, Chloe, and thank you for the work that you do at White and Case.
Yeah, of course. And the entire team at White and Case that's been working on this has worked really hard. We care a lot about giving, access to information to make sure that people do know what their rights are, because like I said, that kind of information is power. And the fact that you can have it easily accessible on your phone and divvied up by state, I think is a fantastic thing. I have it on my phone for protester rights and for police rights, and it's just a great tool that I hope word will spread and more people will take access to it and will hopefully help people down the line.
Definitely. Thanks, Chloe.
Thanks again, Chloe, for the work that you do at White and Case, and thank you all for the collaboration.
Absolutely. We were happy to be a part of this app.
Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Please stay tuned and follow us on social media platforms, and stay tuned at knowyourrightscamp.org.